So I just read a fantasy manga about nutshots. Let's talk about it. As a big fan of fantasy manga, I feel the genre can come across as incredibly oversaturated. You've got your standard cookie-cutter isekai clones, but even when you're dealing with the top contenders for the fantasy genre, you're still running into a lot of common tropes. I'm talking things like dragons, magic, castles, the whole feudal system. It all starts to blend together. A lot of fantasy manga will try to combat this by having a very specific focus. Something like, what if it's a fantasy, but it's about the villain? Or it's a fantasy, but the main character has a smartphone? Or, in this case, it's a fantasy, but the main character kicks everybody in the nuts. Of course, it is a tad more complex than that. While the main character is certainly a practitioner of the art of low blows, it's all sorts of low blows. But the nutshots are the most entertaining. I figure me and you will read the first chapter together, and then I'll give you my thoughts on the series as a whole. That said, if you enjoy this type of content, I'd appreciate any likes or subscriptions you'd like to give me, and especially any comments with suggestions or Michael. We open on Nikola getting Kikalud out of the party. I'll pause right here for the applause to settle. Fantastic. Nikola, both surprised by his party's lack of eyes and this current revelation, recounts how he joined the hero's party in the first place. He actually didn't want to, but he thought that joining this adventure might be a good way to cure his current lazy bum lifestyle. The party then went on countless adventures, found out that the real treasure was the friendship they formed along the way, and then decided to throw out that friendship because it had just a little too much penis. Nikola protests the kicking, but is called a coward by the female knight and the female cleric, who happens to be his apprentice. She claims that while Nikola's training was in fact effective, the reputation loss that she and the party have suffered from being labeled cowards are apparently too great of a burden to bear. The cleric asks Nikola if he can possibly imagine what it's like to be mocked by strangers, immediately after telling him that she was getting secondhand mocking from his first-hand reputation. Not the brightest holy light in God's kingdom, I'd say. Nikola confirms one last time that they want him gone, and he says, "All right, fam, I'm on my way." Unfortunately, in a fit of hypocrisy, his former party attack him once his back is turned. Because they really don't want to be seen as cowards, you guys. They rob Nikola of his equipment and leave him laying on the ground bleeding in the forest. We then cut to 2 years later, where Nikola is completely fine and is a lazy bastard again. He explains to the woman from ReZero, who he's currently mooching off of, that he can't get a job because if he does, he can't train. She says, cut the bullshit, and he's like, all right, you got me. I just want to sit at home all day. I can respect that. Still, Satella tells him that he needs to get a job because even though he's still traumatized from that group betrayal, she thinks that being a high school teacher will help restore his faith in humanity. Yeah, I think a lot of characters in this manga are just stupid. Anyway, it turns out the school that she wants him to work at was founded by Shinzo Abe, because it's all about trying to get virgins laid. It turns out, in order for Nikola to be a teacher, he needs to pass an exam, which he's the least resistant to doing. I guess my man is an academic. Just like Tesla before him. Despite his reluctance, after a final threat of eviction, the man heads to the exam. On the way to school, he bumps into various fantasy races, just to remind you that this is still a fantasy manga. Fantasy or not, Nikola runs into a problem that any main character of any genre can experience. He's broke. Luckily for him, though, there's a young woman being harassed nearby. He grabs her away from her attackers and runs away, unfortunately hitting a dead end. The villains corner them, and aha! It turns out it was the villains who were actually cornered, not Nikola, this whole time. Nikola then sucker punches the villain and answers the girl's question. He's going to be a teacher. A teacher who punches kids in the nuts. Which, if you think about it, is in direct opposition to the school's goals. Well, there was the first chapter, and let's talk about the elephant in the room. It had no nut shots. Disappointing, I know, but I assure you, if you stick with it, there's plenty of those to come. That said, this was probably one of the most lackluster first chapters I've read. It had a really over-the-top beginning, and a lot of weird angles that I'm not a fan of. And then there was the whole thing with the time skip, where he was left for dead, but then was just completely fine. They don't really address that. Frankly, the first chapter itself was a huge kick in the nuts. Now, if you're following the standard 3-chapter rule, which I think is a decent metric, it does get a little better because the characters are fleshed out a little bit more, you see the major players, but overall, it's still not what I'd consider a great read. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of those iconic nut shots to laugh at later, but there's like a persistent, stupid logic that affects all of the other characters to make the main character and his new apprentice look good, and the villains have a really exaggerated assholery, which it does make it more entertaining when they eventually get stomped on by the world, but it's very cartoony and makes it hard for me to recommend this to other people. All that said, the manga is really short at only 18 chapters. You could probably knock it out in about an hour or so. However, that does mean there are a lot of rushed plot points and some story threads that don't go anywhere. I'm assuming it was axed because, frankly, it wasn't that good. Now, despite how shitty I've made this series sound, and believe me, I do consider it quite mediocre, I do believe that all media has something that somebody can enjoy. And frankly, I need a little bit more positivity in my life, which brings me to the next segment.
Oh, wow.
Now, the top one is probably what got you to click on this video, and is the reason I read it. It's funny to watch people get kicked in the nuts. Sometimes that's all you need. Some smaller points are, the art isn't half bad, it's not my cup of tea with the way they use angles, but it's certainly not the worst I've ever seen. At only 18 chapters, like I said, it's quite easy to knock out, so it might not feel like a huge waste of time. And finally, it's a non-isekai fantasy, and we need to support more of those. Isekai is a tired genre, and I keep thinking that every time I read a new one. Plus, it's better than Rent a Girlfriend.